This tutorial will be creating an exploding text effect, and this is achieved using the particles in Blender and several other methods. This video you're seeing now is actually the version 2 of the exploding text effect, and it was the version 1 video that was very popular, and I had many requests on creating a tutorial. But since then, Blender has several new techniques to help with this effect, and I've also learnt several new methods of improving it, and so I created the version 2 video to accompany this tutorial. So I've just loaded up the default blend file, and I'm using Blender 2.63 for this, and first thing we have to do is build the actual objects that are going to shatter and the objects that they're going to collide with. So I'm just going to delete the cube, go into front view, Shift A, add a text, tab into edit mode, type 3 because that's what we're going to be using, and then in the font panel, which should have appeared, I'm going to choose Arial Bold, as that's the font I used in the video, and then I'll scale that up a bit. Now, because of the way we need to do this, we can't actually use this text object as the object that's going to shatter, because we need more control over where the faces are going to be. So we're actually going to just use this as a template, and we're going to have to manually build the object. And so I'm just going to Shift A, add mesh plane, and I'm just going to speed this bit up, and basically what I'm going to be doing is doing simple extrusions just to create the 3. So now that we have a basic template, I'm just going to add a subsurf modifier, and then I'm going to go around again and just make sure all the edge loops line up with the original 3. And to do that, I'm just going to enable the modifier to appear during edit mode, as if it's been applied. So it roughly lines up now. I'm just going to disable that option and then go in and add a few edge loops to sharpen up these edges. And then just make sure they're all spread out so we still get a smooth edge. So now that we've got our 3, we can delete the original 3, the original text object, and we're left with our new mesh. So now that we've finished, we're actually going to apply the subsurf modifier, and we're then going to actually remove all the edge loops we just put in to sharpen the mesh up. We don't need them now because we've already applied the modifier, but if we don't take them out, then when we add the solidify modifier, which gives the shards a bit of thickness, then we're going to get some overlapping faces, where it solidifies this way and this way. There'll be a patch in the middle where the faces overlap, and this seems to be made worse by having more edge loops in at the edges. And this is because when we actually shatter the object, it's the edge loops that will define where the pieces will shatter. So we want to make sure that at the edges we have larger pieces to avoid the solidify problem. So I'm going to remove by deleting vertices, and then I'm going to alt-click this loop and delete edge loop, alt-click, delete edge loop, and just repeat this to remove the edges. And then one last time, alt-click and delete edge loop. I'm then going to go into face select mode, select everything, and extrude it back on the y-axis. And then we can add in a few edge loops along the width of it, just to give it a bit more detail, but making sure we've got no very close edge loops on the edges. The next thing we want to do is give some randomness to the edges, because if we exploded it as it was, we'd get very even shards, because the shards are controlled by the size of the faces. So if we want random shards, we need random faces. So I'm going to go along and just select random faces all over the mesh. I should probably deselect that one because it'll subdivide too near the edge and create more problems. But just going along, selecting random ones. And the more you do this, the more random shards you're going to get. So then, once we're done, I'm just going to press W and subdivide. And because we're using 2.63, it's used n-gons to subdivide, but we actually want it to use quads and tris. So just pressing T to bring up the Tools menu, I'm going to click this checkbox, and it's gone back to the old method of subdividing. And you can see we've got these very random looking faces now. The next object we need to create is the plane that it will collide with. So going into top view, add mesh, plane, and just scale that up and move it over a bit. One last set of objects we need are a few extra collision objects. Now because we're using a particle system to collide these shards, they won't actually use physically accurate collisions. And so what will happen is all the shards will fall to the bottom and fall on top of each other, when really when they fall there should probably be a bit of bounce, and they'll bounce outwards because there'll be a pile of shards. So we're going to create a fake pile and give it something extra to bounce off. And we're going to do this by using icospheres. So going into top view, add mesh, icosphere. I'm then going to go into edit mode and just in vertex select mode, select one of the top vertices, turn on proportional editing, change it to sharp, and we're just going to press G and Z to create a rather pointed object and give it a bit more randomness to collide with. So just scale that down. And then back into top view and wireframe mode, and we're just going to duplicate this a couple of times to give it something extra to collide with. And I'm then going to shift select all these extra objects, press Ctrl J to join them into one mesh. And then just to make it a bit easier to view, I'm going to set them to be in wire mode just so we can see a bit more of what's going on. The next thing we're going to do is just animate this 3 slightly. So making sure we're on frame 1, I'm going to move the 3 upwards a bit, press I, insert a keyframe for location, and then move to frame 30 and move it down to collide with the plane. Press I, location. It's going to stay like that for 5 frames, another keyframe, and then at frame 48 it's going to move down a little bit more, and that's because by the time we get to this frame it'll be unstable at the bottom because all the shards will have appeared, and so it makes sense for the top to continue to fall down as the bottom becomes unstable. So if we go back to the beginning, we can see it hits, pauses for a second while the bottom bit will explode, and then continue to fall down once the bottom becomes unstable. So the next thing to do is actually make it explode. And to do that we're going to add a particle system. So I'm going to go to the particle tab, press the plus icon, and then we can go back over to the modifier tab and add our explode modifier. And it was important that we added the particle system before it, so it appears before it in the stack, because the explode modifier won't work if it doesn't see a particle modifier before it. Now you can already see it starting to do something, and that's because the explode modifier is looking at the properties of the particle system and saying, well, I'm going to assign certain faces to some of these particles. So we go back to the beginning, press play by Alt A. You can see it is exploding, but a little bit weirdly, and that's just because we haven't fine-tuned our particle settings. One of the main particle settings is when the shards start to appear. You can see that they've already started appearing even though it's only colliding now. So frame 30 is when the shards start appearing, so in the start field I'm going to put 30, and it should probably stop around frame 45. So if we play that again, Alt A, it only starts exploding once it's hit, but we still need to fine tune it quite a bit more. I'm going to put the lifetime up to 250, just so it lasts the length of our animation. I'm then going to change the normal amount from 1, which is how far the particles explode out from the object, and I'm going to change this to a rather low number of 0.09. And that's because mainly, instead of the particles going outwards, we want the particles to go down. And to do that, we're going to use the emitter object properties on the z-axis, because it's in the -z direction that we want the particles to move. However, if we go over to the object panel, we'll see that the rotation is set to 90, and that's from when we originally made the 3. So if we tried to change the particle settings now, the z wouldn't work, because to the object, it's not seeing z as down because it's been rotated. So to simply fix that, we're going to press Ctrl A, and we're going to apply the rotation. So back in the object panel, it now has the rotation all set at 0, and it will see z as being down. So in this field, we're going to put -0.35, and then we're going to move over to rotation. And rotation, we're just going to set a bit of random angular velocity, and I'm going to set that to 0.5 just to give it a bit of random rotation. The other option we need to do, and it's one of the last ones for the particle settings, is in the field weights group, and we're going to set gravity to be 0.9. Now, in mine I wanted it to be slow motion, and I found that even when I put low numbers on the gravity, it wasn't really giving me a slow enough effect. And that's because, and I'm not sure quite how this works, but the scene in the scene panel also has a gravity option, and it's set to -9 on the z-axis. I'm actually going to turn this off, and this gives us greater control, and it actually gives us our slow motion effect. Of course, if you don't want slow motion, then leave that option on, and you'll have to turn up a few of the other options. These are made weaker because they don't need to be so strong because the gravity is so weak. And if we go back to the beginning, Alt A to play it, it's got a bit of a better effect. Now these particles are still looking quite square, so we're going to enable cut edges, and that just enables it to randomly cut the mesh. However, one thing we didn't look at was the actual number of particles and how this will affect the explode modifier. The explode modifier works by looking at the number of faces in the mesh and assigning each of those faces to a particle. So if we go into edit mode, we can see that, just selecting it all, we have 719 faces. So if we want the smallest shards possible, we would need 719 particles. But we have 1,000 set, and this just basically means we have 300 or so particles which aren't doing anything because they have no faces to be assigned to. Just by setting this to a really low number, like 50, you can see the shards have got bigger, and that's because the explode modifier is dividing the mesh by the number of particles. So if you want smaller shards, you have to do more subdivisions and get a higher res mesh. But at the minute, we're going to set this to 719 because this is the maximum it can have. The next thing we're going to do is just add a few extra modifiers. Now you'll see that we're in flat shading mode for the 3, and this won't look very good in the render, so we just go over to the shading tab in the tools panel, which is brought up by pressing T. We'll set it to smooth, and it looks very horrible indeed. Now the dark lines are caused by incorrect normals, so tabbing into edit mode, selecting everything and pressing Ctrl N solves some of them, but this problem is caused by flat faces being set to shade smooth, and Blender doesn't like this. But there is a modifier that can fix this, and it's called the edge split modifier. And this says to effectively split these edges at this specific angle. So if we set this up, we can see that it's going back to what it was, but we want everything under 90 degrees, so this is in degrees, we want everything under 90 degrees to be not split. So I'll just put that down and immediately it works. Now one other thing we need, or one other modifier we need, is the solidify modifier, which I spoke about earlier. And what I'm quickly going to do is just change the display mode on the particles, because we don't really need to see these dots, because, well, we don't need to see them. So under display, I'm going to change it to none quickly, just to make it look a bit better. So back to the modifiers. We've added the solidify modifier, but we're still getting that shading problem again. And that's because the solidify modifier needs to be above the edge split modifier. So I'm just going to press the up arrow, and it's become a lot better. And you can see it's actually given slight thickness, but if we turn that up, we can see a lot more thickness to our shards, and this is the effect we want. But you can see here, these flickering edges, that's where the solidify modifier is overlapping itself. Now if you put even thickness on, it should improve it a bit, and it has on some of them, but simply this may be a bit too strong, so I'll just tone it down a bit, and we're getting some over here, and this is when you want to go back in and edit the mesh maybe a bit more, and remove some of those closer edge loops which are causing this. And these will appear in the render, and I do have that in my one. And you can see if I turn that down, you can see where it's starting to overlap itself. So at the minute, I'll just leave it like that. And I think on mine, I even animated this value so it would change over time, but not so it was noticeable to the viewer. And if we play this back, it should all be visible. And you can see we've got those shards happening. But we still don't have the collision set up. So, very quickly, and it is very simple, go over to the physics panel, with the plane selected, enable collision, and then I'm going to put the particle damping up, and the particle friction up. And I'm also going to give these slightly random values, so it gives a random effect to the particles. And these values basically just slow down the particles once they collide with the plane. And the particle damping will control how much they bounce away. So if you want really bouncy particles, you turn this all the way down. I'm also going to enable collision for these because I want these to give even more collision. So I'm going to give them roughly the same values and also a bit of randomness. So if we go back to the beginning, we play that. And what you may find is that some of the pieces will still fall through, but they're just pieces that were already through it when they started being emitted. So the rest of the pieces shouldn't go through, but it was only the ones that were partially through the plane already, just because I didn't place it quite properly, and they were already through the plane, so they won't collide with it. But the rest of the ones should. So if I continue playing, the rest of these pieces, although they are slightly inaccurate in the fact that they're going through the plane partially, they are in fact bouncing back up, which is the effect we want. Another option with the solidify modifier is to use the material offset options, and this is how I achieve the effect of having a different material on the outside as I did to the inside. So we're just going to add two different materials. One's going to be red, add a second one, and this will be white. And over in the modifier options for solidify, we're going to offset that one and offset that one. And if we press back, then press play, we can see that the shards inside are white, but on the outside it's red, and I think that just gives a nice effect, and it's easy to see where it's cracking because of that. Now the last option is actually controlling how the 3 cracks. At the moment it goes randomly all over, so if we go back a few steps, it starts cracking all over. But in my mind I thought it made more sense for it to crack at the bottom first where it impacts, for the crack to travel up and then around the top, because at the minute these pieces are cracking before some of these pieces, even though the force of the impact would have to travel through this part first. So it doesn't make sense that these are cracking, but not these. So the next part will actually deal with how to control where it cracks. And to do this, we're going to use an option that maybe a few of you don't know about. And it's the fact that if we go in texture, while the 3 is selected, because it has a particle system applied, we can actually apply a texture to the particle system. So I'm just going to click new, change the type to blend, and it creates this gradient. And I'm then going to change from generated mapping to UV mapping. But to use UV mapping, we have to have a UV map. So I'm going to very quickly select everything, press U, project from view. Then in the UV image editor, I'm just going to turn off proportional editing. And then I'm going to scale up the 3 so it fits inside. And what's going to happen is that this gradient is going to be mapped directly onto here. So this will be black, this will be white, and in between is gradient. Go back to the 3D view, come out of edit mode. And unfortunately, to get this to update, you need to change one of these options. And it doesn't matter what you change, I'm just going to change it from vertical and back to horizontal, just so we've changed an option and now it'll update. And it is a slightly annoying feature. But if we press play, you can see it cracks on the left and the crack travels from left to right. And that's because it's using the UV map. However, we want it to start at the bottom. So you saw this option earlier. I'm just going to change it to vertical. It goes a bit weird because it hasn't recalculated it. So I press play again. And the cracks start at the bottom and end at the top. And the reason that happens is because the texture by default is mapped to the time option. And where something is black, that will emit first. And where it is white, that will emit last. So black is at the bottom because it's mapped on using the UVs, and white is at the top, so it's just going to go upwards directly. But I said earlier that I wanted it to curve round, because if we go forward, the tip of the 3 is still cracking before the crack has travelled through the object. So we just need to update the UVs a bit. So I'll go into edit mode, make sure everything's selected, and go into the UV image editor. Now, as I just explained, the white, which is mapped to the top of the image, emits last, and the black, which is mapped to the bottom, emits first. So if we want the tip to be the last thing that's emitted, because if we travel up and round, that should be the last thing that is emitted, then it should be at the top of the map. But at the minute, it's not. This part is at the top, so this part will be last to emit, which is not what we want. So what effectively we want to do is straighten out the top of the 3. And to do that, I'm going to select UV sync, which means the selection will match whatever is selected in the 3D view. And when we're in this mode, we can select faces, and just selecting a whole section, press G to grab, and we can move it away from the rest of the UVs. And I'm just going to rotate it so it's pointing upwards. I'm then going to go around and do the same in sections, just rotating them so they're pointing upwards. And what we're effectively doing is straightening out the top of the 3. And that should be enough. So now we've got these pieces, I'm going to overlap them slightly. And you'll see that, as I said, we've straightened out the top. So now, the last part of the mesh that we want to be emitted is at the top, which is this bit. And I just have to scale it down so it fits inside the UV map. Go back into 3D view, tab out. Remember to just switch between them to make sure it updates the settings. Press Alt A. The crack goes up and travels round. And you can see that because we animated it so it would continue to move down, that once this is cracked and this has effectively become disconnected, it will continue to fall down realistically, and then the rest of the animation happens. So that's roughly it. I hope this has been of some use to people. But remember, this isn't a replacement for true physics collisions, but this is a quick way to be able to control how an object explodes, and you saw it was quite easy to direct where the object cracked. So if you're doing lots of letters, you just have to UV unwrap it in a certain way so that certain parts explode first. That's the end of the tutorial. If it's been useful, please say so in the comments, and if you think I can do something better, please also say that in the comments, and I hope to see you in the next tutorial. Goodbye.